In the course of a crazy few hours in December 2024, South Korea's then president tried to seize control from parliament, declaring martial law. But the politicians beat the soldiers to the floor of the National Assembly, some literally facing down the guns, others barricading the doors before voting down the declaration. A short time later, Yoon Suk Yeol withdrew his extraordinary measure and was on his way to impeachment, arrest and prosecution. Today, the former president arriving at court in Seoul for sentencing in just one of multiple trials.
Former President Yoon Suk Yeol has been sentenced to 5 years in prison for
this trial centering on accusations he'd bypassed cabinet members, destroyed evidence and evaded arrest.
Today's guilty verdict is a decision that overly simplifies the boundary between the president's exercise of constitutional authority and criminal liability. If this reasoning stands, no future president will be able to make decisions in times of crisis, and acts of governance will always be at risk of being retroactively recast as crimes.
Today's sentencing relates in large part to Yoon's extraordinary efforts to resist being taken into custody for weeks after his impeachment. His own security staff eventually outmatched by thousands of police in January last year. Yoon's public reasoning for declaring martial law was that North Korean elements had infiltrated South Korea's opposition. For his opponents, it was simply an attempt to usurp South Korea's hard-won democracy, to bypass a National Assembly that was thwarting his budget, as well as a corruption investigation that implicated his wife. His actions, threatening to take the country back to the days of pre-1987 authoritarianism, brought hundreds of thousands to the streets in protest. There were also conservative counter-protests, both strands of opinion voiced in Seoul today.
Overall, when I look at President Yoon's actions, I honestly think that for me the sentence was a bit too lenient.
This verdict is truly heartbreaking because it means that fairness and common sense in the country has collapsed.
Bad news on the doorstep. I couldn't take one more step.
Yoon's sentencing represents a stunning fall from power for a president who was once a prosecutor. He himself had helped convict two former presidents for abusing their power. The most serious of his remaining trials involves the offence of leading an insurrection. Prosecutors this week asking for the death penalty. The verdict in that case is due next month. Well, joining us now is Edward Howe, a lecturer on international relations at the University of Oxford. He has written extensively on politics in North and South Korea. Thanks very much for joining us today. When you look back at what happened in December 2024, I mean, can you just encapsulate the sheer scale of the ructions of this move by the former president?
We must remember that South Korea is a very youthful democracy. South Korea only transitioned to democracy in 1987. And the last time that martial law had been imposed was in South Korea's pre-democracy era, particularly in the 1980s, but also beforehand. And so when President Yoon Suk Yeol decides to impose martial law on the evening, quite late in the evening, at 10:30 on the 3rd of December 2024. Of course, this is a shock. This is a clear shock both to South Korea, but also to the world, and asks lots of questions about South Korea's domestic politics and how this links to Seoul's position in the world.
Well, indeed, I mean, his pretext for doing so was what has been long a strand of opinion in conservative politics in South Korea, that there is this sort of malign presence of North Korean influence, especially in the political left in South Korea. And even at the time, there was a reasonable constituency of people on the streets supporting him. I mean, does it speak to a real divide within South Korea?
Yes, this political polarization within South Korea is not new. I think that's very important to stress. And even after Yoon's impeachment and ouster from power, we saw only earlier today, only around about 100 or so pro-Yoon individuals supporting him outside the courthouse. I think what's important to bear in mind is that polarization between the left and right in South Korea has been a very common feature of South Korean politics. When President Yoon declared martial law, he was trying to rule over an opposition-dominated National Assembly, and this was a key hindrance for the president. But I also think that his declaration of martial law goes beyond that. He told so few people within his cabinet, so few people, and this is one of the charges that's being put against him at the moment.
Indeed, that is one of the things for which he was convicted today in this sentencing, along with evading arrest in those extraordinary scenes where his own security staff were ranged against the country's police forces. But the more serious charge still has yet to be ruled on, that he led an insurrection, and there seems to be public support for the call for the death sentence in that case.
President Yoon is not the first South Korean president to be subjected to a potential death penalty. These sentences have been commuted, often to imprisonment. It's very likely that Yoon will face a similar fate. There is a culture in South Korea of pardoning past presidents. I think what is clear, though, is that these charges of calling Yoon a ringleader of an insurrection, we need to understand that this is not just something that's been made by the prosecutors. This was very much made by the then opposition parties after Yoon declared martial law as well at the time. And if I may add, one of the things to think about in terms of domestic support is that whilst Yoon's domestic support plummeted to an all-time low, a nadir of around about 10 or 11% in that week in December, between his impeachment and his removal from power in April of last year, his support rose to nearly 50%, to the highest it had ever been. And I think one of the reasons to bear in mind is that there was a lot of overreach on the part of the hard left in South Korea to do all they could to get rid of him.
So to what extent then does that kind of political environment, the young democracy that you talk about, does that to some extent explain why, we've seen Park Geun-hye prosecuted before her, we've seen Lee Myung-bak, another conservative, prosecuted. I mean, Yoon himself involved in both of those prosecutions. What is it that appears to be so sort of open to abuse or fragile within the system?
I think actually that the system is not fragile, it's both fragile and extremely resilient. One of the things that the events surrounding Yoon Suk Yeol demonstrated is this resilience of democracy. Due process was followed. Yoon was impeached, he was removed from power, an election was held, and now the left-leaning Lee Jae-myung has taken over. So though South Korea is a young democracy, which means it will face challenges that more mature democracies in terms of age will not face in the present day, I think South Korea as a democracy is extremely resilient, and these incidents actually prove that rather than refute it.
Great. Thank you very much. Edward Howe, appreciate your time today.
Thank you.